Hello and welcome back to our Playwriting 101 series with Julia Fisher. In a previous episode on creating believable backstory, we talked about the fact that you should keep 60% of your backstory unrevealed to your audience. But what do we do with that extra 40%, the backstory that you do want to reveal to your audience? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. How to reveal backstory to your audience in an interesting way using effective exposition. Let's go. So what is exposition? Exposition is a fancy way of saying introducing background information. And exposition is almost always necessary in your plays to reveal relationships between your characters, to reveal past events that have happened before your play is started. But exposition is often used very poorly, and your audience will notice right away. Have you ever in a play or movie heard dialogue that goes something like this? "Oh, hey, baby sister, it's been 6 years since I've seen you." "Yeah, it's been since Grandpa's funeral." "Have you seen Mom since she got that new job selling toasters?" "No, but I'm excited for her. It reminds me of the toaster pastries she always made us when we were children, back when you and I were closer." Gross, right? If the dialogue doesn't sound like something anyone would actually say in real life, your audience isn't gonna buy it. They're going to recognize right away that you're just trying to feed them background information, and they're going to get kind of annoyed with you. The exposition from that example was way too obvious. And here are a few more hints on how to avoid too obvious exposition in your play. First, if you ever have a character saying, "Remember when?" it's a pretty good sign that you might be about to introduce some exposition that is too obvious. In addition, if you have a character reading from a diary or looking back through old texts, that's also a sign that maybe you're venturing into some too obvious exposition grounds. A third sign is if you're tempted to use a narrator just to introduce background information to your audience, you can probably reveal that same information in a more interesting way. That doesn't mean that narrators or diary entries or character memories can't be used very effectively, but they are often used just to introduce exposition, and if that's the only reason why you're using them, think more carefully about how you want to introduce that information. So, Julia, you might be asking, how do we use exposition well? Well, here's a couple different tips for you. First, just don't think about it. This seems a little counterintuitive, but if you're writing your dialogue with your audience in mind, trying to make sure that they get every piece of information that they need, then you're going to be much more likely to be using too obvious exposition. However, if you ignore the fact that you have an audience and you just focus on what the characters actually need to say to each other, then you're probably going to end up giving us the background information that we need in a much more natural way. Just focus on what would these characters actually say to each other in these circumstances, and write that as your dialogue. Then later, you can go back and say, okay, is there any information that the audience didn't get through the way that these characters talk to each other? And then, if you realize that you still need to add in additional exposition, you can go to tip number 2. Tip number 2, how to sneak in exposition so your audience doesn't realize it's happening. There are a couple different ways to do this. One way of sneaking in exposition is to do it through humor. If the dialogue that you're writing is humorous and the characters are making fun of each other or telling jokes, then the audience will be so busy laughing that they won't notice the exposition that you've slid in there as easily. 2, exposition through conflict. If your characters are arguing about something or they're debating back and forth, then you can sneak in exposition through their debate or their argument. And again, the audience will be so caught up in the emotions of their argument that they won't necessarily notice the exposition that you've laid in there as well. 3, exposition through questioning and answering. This method only works if you have a character who doesn't know information and needs it from another character. If this is the case, then you can have that character who doesn't know the information directly ask questions to the other character and receive that information. And then the audience will also be receiving that same information. If you have two characters who both know the information and they're just reciting the information back to give it to the audience, it's not going to feel good. But if you have that second character who needs information, maybe they just came back in town and are trying to catch up on all the news, then you can have a character give that information back to them and it feels natural. The fourth way of sneaking in exposition is to spread it out throughout your play. If you have too much information, too much exposition at the very beginning of your play, or even anywhere in the middle, then it feels like a lot and your audience is going to notice. But if you sprinkle your exposition throughout your whole play, saving pieces of it until the end or farther along in the middle, then it's going to keep your audience more engaged, wondering what's going to happen next, wondering what is going on, what happened in the past, and it won't be so much background information to swallow all at once. So, tip number 1 was to not think about exposition as you're writing your play. Tip number 2 is to sneak in exposition when you know that you need it. And tip number 3 is sometimes to just not have exposition. If there's background information that we don't need, you don't have to put it in your play. Remembering that 60% rule, you should have at least 60% of your backstory that you just keep to yourself and you never actually tell the audience. Think about Romeo and Juliet. The Montagues and the Capulets are fighting. Why are they fighting? We never find out. And it's because it doesn't really matter. We don't really need to know the whole backstory as to why the Capulets and the Montagues are fighting. We just know that they're fighting, and that's all we need for the play to work. So if there's exposition in your play that the audience doesn't really need, maybe just hold back on it. They don't need to know. My last piece of advice for you about exposition is just to remember that your audience is not stupid. They will go along with you as you tell your story. They don't need all at the beginning, all of the background information about your characters. They can figure it out. If your play is about a mother and a son, we don't need to know in the first 3 lines if they're mother and son. We can figure that out through the way that they're talking with each other, through the way that the actors are interacting with each other, through what they're talking about, and then maybe a few pages down the line, it will be confirmed that they're mother and son. But you don't need to, the very first line, go, "Hey mom, how's it going?" "Great, son. How's it been? I'm so glad that you celebrated your 38th birthday last week." We don't need that much. We'll go along with you. We'll figure it out as we go. So, we've learned today how to avoid obvious exposition, how to leave exposition out if we don't need it, and how to effectively sneak in exposition when the audience does need it. I hope this helps you deliver the background information of your play to your audience in an engaging and interesting and realistic way. Thank you so much for joining me today. Check out some of my other videos in this Playwriting 101 series. Happy writing and have a great day.